What's up, everybody? Welcome to the second edition of today's episode of the Thomas Take Sports Podcast. I am your host, Ryan Thomas, here to bring you another segment of the Thomas Take podcast. I started in January of 2016. We are now in the 10th month, or the 9th month of the Thomas Take. I'm very excited to bring it to you guys. Very excited to, once again, this has been so much fun for me. I've been able to open up a lot of awesome connections through this podcast. It's grown in the amount of per episode that I do. There's definitely an increase. I feel like when I don't do one for a little while, if I'm busy with work or things like that, when one is dropped, the demand for it is high, which makes me really happy. Makes me think that people like to listen to me and appreciate my opinion, and that's really awesome. I can't thank you guys enough. So, on to the next topic. UFC 204 went down October 8th. Michael Bisping put his middleweight belt on the line in Manchester, England, versus none other than the 46-year-old legendary Dan Henderson. And obviously, this fight had so much drama built into it, being that Bisping and Henderson had faced each other before 7 years ago at UFC 100, which up until UFC 202 was the highest grossing pay-per-view in UFC history, and in large part due to the most famous knockout that has ever been connected in UFC history, which was Dan Henderson landing that patented H-bomb on Michael Bisping 7 years ago at UFC 100. Could Dan Henderson turn back the clock and win in his last pro mixed martial arts fight? Not only win the fight, but win the one belt that eluded his entire mixed martial arts career. Pride champion, two-weight Pride champion, at the time middleweight and welterweight, which those are the term names for light heavyweight and middleweight in what is in the UFC today, light heavyweight and middleweight. 205 champion in Pride, 185-pound champion in Pride as well, simultaneously. A fact that does not get mentioned, especially in the time of today, where Conor McGregor is trying to accomplish that feat inside the UFC. They say, this would be the first time it's ever been done in UFC history where two fighters have held the belt simultaneously. Well, when they count the records, they do count Pride, and Dan Henderson did it in Pride. So it's kind of tough. I'm shocked that has gone unnoticed, because he was a two-weight champion, and he was winning it in tournament style in partial moments. So Dan Henderson is a legend. There's no doubt about it. Did Dan Henderson turn back the clock? The answer is yes, but he did not win. And the judges' scorecards read a unanimous decision, 48-47 Bisping, 48-47 Bisping, and 49-46 Bisping. And in watching the fight, I watched the fight once again at Buffalo Wild Wings in Niagara Falls, New York. It was very exciting to watch it with my dad, watch it with my friends. Me and my dad have been UFC fans for a very long time. We watched the first Bisping versus Henderson fight together. We remember the knockout. We remember the Ultimate Fighter season. That season, in my eyes, was one of the best seasons in Ultimate Fighter history. So we were very excited for this fight. I, going into this fight, did not see this fight going five-minute rounds. But let's go over the fight. Let's dig deep into the actual dynamic of the fight. Round one, Michael Bisping was doing what he needed to do. He was moving around, kind of picking his shots. And towards the end of the round, probably about 1 minute and 30 left, almost 2 minutes left, Dan Henderson landed that patented H-bomb that put Bisping down. And Bisping was knocked down. Henderson was dropping huge elbows, huge hammer fists to Michael Bisping's face. And Bisping did not get up for the remainder of that round. Did not get to his feet. So Henderson's landing these punches. Even though Bisping is not knocked out, he is not able to get up until that round ended. Second round, Bisping is on the offensive a little bit more. Got to give him credit. He has the heart of a lion to go back out there after that drubbing in the last minute and 30 seconds of the first round and go right after Dan Henderson again. And Henderson put him down again, around the same amount of time as he did in the second round. Only difference was this time, I believe Bisping was able to get to his feet. And Bisping it was right at the end of the second round. I get them both mixed up because the exchange was practically the same, where Henderson landed that punch and Henderson was on top of Bisping. But in the second round, it was definitely more later on. Definitely more later on in the second round. The round had ended shortly thereafter. So, third round comes out, and Bisping knows that he can't take another one of those right hands or he's probably going to go down. He's got to come up with a different strategy. He's got to come up with combinations, stick and move, stay away from that right hand that Henderson has landed already twice in the fight. On my scorecard, round 1 was a 10-8. He almost finished the fight. Anytime someone almost finishes a fight in a round, it's a 10-8 round. Round 2, I had it for Henderson 10-9. So at that point, it would be 20-17 Henderson. So the next 3 rounds I had for Bisping. Actually, the next 2 rounds, I'm sorry. The next 2 rounds, rounds 3 and round 4, I had for Bisping. Round 5 was the round that decided the fight on many of the judges' scorecards, including mine. And I'm not a professional mixed martial arts judge, but I do know the difference between a round that's won in mixed martial arts and a round that's not. And I know the criteria that is needed in order for a guy to win a round and for a guy to lose a round. And for whatever reason, along the way, along the mainstream spike that the UFC has been launched on over the last 5 years, the perception of what wins a round and what loses a round in the UFC has changed. And in the course of that 5th round, that round was so close. The one thing that could decide it is a takedown. The one thing that could decide it is a takedown defense. And in that 5th round, Henderson landed a takedown. Bisping was never in any danger of, or Henderson was never in any danger of losing the fight. Bisping never put him in harm's way. Anytime Bisping tried to maybe put him in harm's way, Henderson would land a punch that was hard, where Bisping would back off. Bisping landed some nice body kicks. He picked his punches. He landed nice kicks to the legs, to the body of Henderson, also to the groin of Dan Henderson. Whether that was on purpose or not, I don't know, but I do know that Dan Henderson took advantage of the time that was granted to him by the referee, which he has full access to. There's no rule against taking a 5-minute break. The time is the time that you can take, and he took as much time as he needed. There's no rules against that. For someone to say that he was doing it on purpose, he can choose to use the time that the referee had given him. And if he was sucking wind and he needed to gain fresh breath or two, then so be it. And he did. So I had the fight 48-47 Henderson. That was the way I had it going. I watched it live, and I thought Bisping won the fight. I thought he did enough to win the fight. But in watching that 5th round, that was really what it came down to for me. In watching that 5th round again, I thought, I honestly don't think he won. Henderson dropped him twice. Henderson landed the takedown and almost finished the fight. Dan Henderson looked like he just took a shower after the fight. Michael Bisping looked like he put his face through a meat grinder. The criteria in which a fighter is given a win is not really fair. It's very flawed. And the fight reminded me of John Jones versus Alexander Gustafsson. Not quite the same, but almost the same, where the fight did come down to the fifth and final round, where I thought, being that Alexander Gustafsson landed the, early shots to kind of put Jones out on his feet, not really, on the brink of getting knocked out, but Gustafsson was clearly outclassing John Jones in the first 3 rounds of that fight. And John Jones won rounds 4 and 5, to me, on my scorecards for that fight. This is a little bit different. Came down to that 5th round. It was 2-2 heading into that 5th round. But Dan Henderson did win that first round 10-8. All 3 judges' scorecards were released after the fight. They released the judges' scorecards, and the judges' scorecards said 10-9 for Dan Henderson. I don't know how you could score that round 10-9 when Dan Henderson was within inches of finishing the fight. You give him 1 point more than the guy that was almost knocked out in the first round. That does not make much sense to me. That doesn't seem too fair. Especially when you know what was going to happen afterwards. Call this fight, judge this fight at face value. If Henderson wins this fight, he's walking off into the sunset with the belt. The belt's going to be vacated anyway. Would it have been a colossal failure for Michael Bisping? Of course. But you don't grant a fighter a fight just because it might have been a bad loss for the guy if he lost. If he lost the fight, he lost the fight. His face looked very different after the fight. He's suspended medically 6 months on a medical suspension. He cannot fight, cannot train, cannot practice. He can't even go for a jog due to the damage that his face has. I believe, much like a situation with George St. Pierre and Josh Koscheck after their second fight, Josh Koscheck could not leave Canada, being that he had a hematoma under his eye. Same thing with Michael Bisping. He's still in Manchester. Obviously, he's from that area. He's a UK fighter, but he lives in California. He told everyone he was going to destroy Dan Henderson. I'm going to put the old man away. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that. He didn't do that. And in actuality, in losing the fight, in the case of Dan Henderson, he actually won more walking out of the octagon. He won more. It was a moral victory, and they do exist. Dan Henderson won the moral victory over Michael Bisping. The first fight, he put him out very quickly. The second fight, in the second round, he almost knocked him out even sooner than he did in the first fight, and he almost knocked him out in the second round as well. In the second fight. 46 years old, he went the distance with the middleweight champion. The guy that was supposed to beat him pretty easily, being that Henderson is, quote, long in the tooth. Dan Henderson, the best fighter to never win a UFC belt. Without a doubt. I would put him on my Mount Rushmore, top 5, maybe even all time. You really look at what he did, nobody is ever going to do what he did. What he did is in the past, and that stands the test of time, because things are different now. The way that Dan Henderson fought, the fighters that he fought, over the course of his Pride career alone, and his Strikeforce career, when he had left the UFC and went to Strikeforce, knocked out Fedor Emelianenko in a heavyweight fight, where he was a heavyweight at 225 pounds. That's a small heavyweight. That's like what Randy Couture was fighting at when he was a heavyweight in the UFC. Through the looping underneath punch that face planted Fedor Emelianenko, Henderson was in deep trouble, and he got out of that fight. As it stands now, in my eyes, Dan Henderson would be the middleweight champion, walking out of the octagon, riding off into the sunset as the middleweight champion. 48-47 Henderson, that's how I had it. Take care, guys. That was the Thomas Take.